The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Toby Manhire with a special edition of Gone By Lunchtime. We've had a succession in recent years of memoirs by former politicians, current and former politicians, and they're really welcome. You know, it's always good to read and understand the under-the-hood reality of politics, that something other than just the kind of talking points and spin cycle that we so often get. The most recent cab off that rank is one Stephen Joyce, who was a long-time List MP for the National Party. He also was the campaign chair for five different National Party campaigns, from Don Brash through John Key and up to Bill English. He came in to discuss his book On the Record the other day, and we talked about the nature of campaigns. We talked about some of the more colourful incidents in his political history, including the time he was struck on the forehead by, I think, what is technically named a squeaky pecker, about his Eminem moments, and also about his relationships with the public service, about the National Party's ups and downs, about Jamie Lee Ross, about, we didn't get to Nova Pay, so sorry if you've tuned in just to hear about Nova Pay, you're going to be sorely disappointed. We also talked about how some of the lessons of those campaigns of years gone by could apply to the campaign that has really begun playing out already in 2023. This podcast, all our podcasts, are only possible, genuinely wouldn't be able to do it unless we had your help. Spin-off members contributing means that we can continue to make these, and we do want to do that. Thanks also to Te Aihe Butler, the producer, for making everything work. I started by asking Stephen Joyce about whether there was anything in the current campaign that was giving him fever dreams and tremors, given what happened in elections gone by. Stephen Joyce, welcome. The last few weeks have conjured up roads of national significance reborn, fiscal hole rhetoric. Are you getting flashbacks? Are you getting much deja vu?
Oh, you do a little bit, but that's the nature of politics. No, I think it's probably in terms of the roads, it's probably an acknowledgement that actually that was quite a successful program, and so you know people would sort of adopt something similar. And in terms of the fiscal stuff, well, it's a legitimate debate every election, and it will go on ad infinitum, I'm sure, election to election.
Well, I think maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. Are you involved at all? Are you sort of firing off texts of advice to Chris Bishop?
I'm probably, if anything, I describe myself as phone a friend.
Okay.
Somebody wants to call on there.
Yeah. Hasn't happened yet?
I get the odd call.
Yeah.
From different people, but I've tried to stay out of it since 17 because I did 5, and 5's elections.
5 elections. How many is campaign chair?
5
is
five.
campaign chair.
Yeah.
Right.
So That's a lot. And I remember sitting around because, that post-election conference, I don't know whether you've gone to
Stephen
those.
Levine event.
Yeah.
Love that.
And I went to 5 of them as campaign chair. And in the 5th one, I was looking around, and I think the only people that had been to all 5 was Stephen Levine, Colin James, and me. And I thought to myself, well, I always thought of myself as the new boy. And suddenly I'm the longer in the tooth one. It's really time to stop doing this.
Now, this book is coming out ahead of an election, but unlike, I recall one, for example, by a former colleague of yours, Judith Collins, which came out before an election and signalled something potentially about her ambitions.
Maybe.
You're not lining up, I don't think, to be National Party at this point.
Not at all.
That book was called Pull No Punches, and your book, it's not. You don't go softly. You do cast a bit of shade and make a few, gentle criticisms, but you're not. Doesn't seem like you're trying to settle scores particularly.
No, I'm not. I was just really trying to tell it how it was.
Yeah.
And of course, it's still edited highlights because even in a full-length book, there's lots of stories that never make it. But they were memorable stories to me, and maybe some people will find them memorable, and hopefully people will get a sense of what it's like doing that job. And I definitely didn't set out to settle any scores. Sometimes I just sort of wrote stuff down and thought, well, you people make of it what you will.
Yeah. There's one bit, one of my favourite lines in the book. So one of the recurring characters in the book is Gemma the dog.
Yes. Sadly passed away. But yes.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
You describe a column written by, I think, your close personal friend Matthew Hooton in the MBR, which contained information that you had a conversation with Todd Muller.
Yeah.
I wasn't 100% sure who was responsible. The only other individual present at my 2 meetings had been Gemma the dog.
That's right.
She was the soul of description.
I looked at her sideways for a while after that.
How is your relationship with Mr. Hooton these days?
I don't have one.
There were some legal tangles, weren't there?
Yeah, there were, and I don't have one.
You didn't really dwell on that in the book. You sort of moved swiftly on.
That's the beauty of your own book, isn't it? You get to dwell on what you like.
Hey, we'll come back to campaigns and politics and all that sort of stuff, but rewinding to where the book sort of really gets cracking is some scenes that I don't think would be obvious to people who encountered you in politics. You don't necessarily strike people as a reprobate student radio type, but that's where it all began. That's where you got things. Right. That's when things really started blooming for you. Tell us a bit about student radio days.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. Radio Massey was brilliant. And actually, for me, it was the starting of my career because I was going to be a vet, got to the end of vet intermediate, missed out, had science all the way through school, had no idea what I wanted to do. And as I write in the book, there's this careers advisor who said, well, just dip into some stuff, do a degree, any degree, and dip into some stuff. And so I thought economics, yes, and radio. But I'll tell you, it took me ages to get up the courage just to go and see. There was a guy called Jeremy Miller who became quite a successful commercial program director starting at XS. And Jeremy was just so cool. And I just didn't have the courage, to sort of buttonhole him at parties I saw him at. And eventually, I was sort of prodded by my girlfriend at the time, went down to this radio station and said, can I have a go? And I got to go, and I loved it. I really loved it. And it was the nature of student radio that you got to do whatever you wanted to do. And we had some great talent there. We had the Corbett brothers. We had Quentin Bright. We had a bunch of people who were very clever. And I just loved it and kept turning up.
And it became more of a focus than your study, which you did complete some years later, which is the study declined in inverse proportion to the radio growth. But you kind of you grew your business chops. You realised that you had maybe a knack for some of the business side as well as the radio side. Yeah,
I think we were pretty naive about that. Right until we got the station on air, and we really just wanted to play REM on the radio. That was, the boys wanted to play decent music in their mind, and our view was that there wasn't enough of that, and it truly wasn't outside of Auckland particularly. And so we that was our mission in life. And then, of course, when we got the station going, you have to pay the bills, and you have to. And I found actually I developed a knack for that business side of it once we got going. I sort of had to.
Yeah.
And then it became progressively more exciting. The radio was still good. I still loved the radio, but the growing the business became the thing.
You conquered New Plymouth, and then you moved to Hamilton, all around the country, and kind of grew this business Radio Works, which is now, of course, Media Works, and through various changes. I think there might be a vacancy for a CEO there. If
Apparently,
fancy going back there.
Right.
Do you ever think about going back to that side of things?
No, not really. I'm a great one for looking forward and trying new things, and actually found writing this book quite hard in some ways, because you sort of have to sort of go back in time and sort of, stay there for a while, 6 or 8 months. And I'd sort of like to get on to the next project. And with radio, I didn't get to do everything I wanted, but I got to do most of what I wanted. And I think you're lucky if you get to do most of what you wanted.
And then Can West came in with their acquisition.
Yep.
Sort of skipping a whole big chunks of this, but in 2000. And you resisted that. You weren't a fan of that. If that hadn't happened, do you think you would have made your way to politics? Or do you think that was fated?
I don't know. I think I would have stayed in radio for quite a bit longer.
Yeah.
And actually, I did come to a point a couple of years afterwards, once I sort of got sort of my head around it all, where I thought, well, actually it turned out to be a pretty good thing, because you did get to do something completely different. And as much as I love radio, I don't think I wanted to spend my whole life in it. There's more to life than that.
And your way into the National Party was from observing it from outside, being a kind of critical assessor of things that had gone wrong, wasn't it? I mean, has that sort of informed your life in politics in some sense?
I suppose. I mean, I was very, very, and I call it privileged because basically they were hurting so much that they basically threw a life raft out to somebody that had come along. As I said, I was a clean skin. I didn't have any place in any of the arguments that had occurred leading into 2002.
Yeah.
And probably I knew some stuff and had run a sizable company and things. So it was a bit of a Hail Mary pass in a way. And so I was privileged to sort of get right into this organisation really quickly. And it was hurting the people. The volunteers were just they weren't in good shape.
Yeah.
And so it was an organisation at its most vulnerable point, and I thought, well, okay, I can make a real mess here if I'm not careful. So we need to be really careful with it. But I did. I probably through that process ended up way deeper in it than most other people that just sort of walk in the front door and say, hey, I'd like to join up.
And you made various recommendations in that report into the 2002 debacle, I guess. You know, and lots of those reforms came to life. One of the other parts that you looked at was the selection process.
Yes.
Do you, with the benefit of hindsight, when we think about the Jamie Lee Ross, Andrew Falloon, Hamish Walker, and so on, some of the selection problems that came to haunt the party later on, whether you got that right, could more have been done there?
Well, we didn't actually change it that much.
Okay.
Because the party, well, firstly, it's been a well-litigated process over the years, long before I turned up. And the party also feels very strongly, and I think rightly, about selecting its own electorate candidates. It's much more independent about that than some of the other parties. And so we just sort of basically said, this is too big to touch. And actually it wasn't apparent at the time that was the broken bit.
Yeah.
So we basically left it, except for a couple of things. We allowed for a process of universal suffrage in an electorate to select a candidate. But that's only been used a couple of times, actually, and in none of the examples that you name. And we also decided to make it that if small electorates couldn't, they weren't big enough to select their own candidate, because there had been some experience of electorates with like 10 members.
Being loaded with 12 people.
They get 12 more, and suddenly, somebody who's got nothing to do with the party selects a candidate and you're stuck with them. So we changed that. But aside from that, the examples of the Jamie Lee Ross and so on, I mean, unfortunately, it's the nature of politics where, some extroverting, larger-than-life types get in before the public, before the party and the public really get a chance to sort of see them in action, and then of course it doesn't turn out so well. I don't know that you'll ever stop that, by the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, and you didn't have Facebook histories that you could
No,
pull through at that
no,
point.
and that is important. And I did the review for the Liberal Party in Australia after the 2019 election, and they weren't doing that well enough. But of course, that can become a weapon too. Internally, the Liberal Party in Australia is much more sub-tribal than the National Party. So they have some quite robust processes for weeding out people whose histories on social media are perhaps indicative of problems to come. But that doesn't always work, because actually people of the more fundamentalist part of the party, or the left part of the party, or the right part of the party will use that as a weapon to get people disqualified from being selected. So that becomes a weapon in itself. So the hardest part is actually having a process which is neutral, which is effectively just objective, which looks at these people without somebody having an agenda behind. Actually, the National Party,
homogenising, I suppose.
yeah, and the National Party is in much better shape than the Liberals to deal with that. But I doubt it'll ever be perfect, but it could be better.
Speaking of the Liberals in Australia, you went on to become 2005 campaign manager, but you might not have, or wouldn't have,
wasn't the intention at all.
Had it not been for Scott Morrison. That's a scoop in the book. I don't know if that's I don't know how widely known that is. Thing.
Scott was going to come over and be our campaign manager. That was the plan, and I thought he would have been great, and he probably would have been. He did the Liberal Party in, I think, a couple of elections in New South Wales, and then he got the call to stay in Australia because there was a seat coming up and he wanted to go into Parliament. And so he sort of at the last minute, well, a year out, or 8 months out, I think, might have been the end of the year, he said, no, I can't do it. And then we were sort of stuck, and Judy's looking around going, how about you? And I'm like, oh. And I thought, I'm not doing anything. This will be a fascinating challenge. Let's do it.
That campaign.
Yes.
When you look back at some of that was the brash leadership campaign that came after Orewa.
Yeah.
There were those John Ansell billboards. You touch on them, but you don't. Again, you move on quite swiftly past that in the book. Does part of you reflect on that and think that was across the line?
No, not really. People read more into that. People read more into that than was ever intended. In that they saw it as a derogatory thing about iwi, where actually it was intended as a sort of clever wordplay that we're either, all together or and that's the debate that's happening again now, of course, as people are debating about, the level of, I suppose, assistance supplied to Māori in areas like health and things like that. And it's a difficult one to answer because, in my way of thinking, I mean, we did lots of things in that area. But interestingly, I think there's a pattern repeating this election that looks like 05 to 08. And I think the difficulty with the politics of both periods is that the Labour Party has got out ahead of public opinion. And we didn't actually have much debate about ethnic issues in the 9 years that we were in government. And we spent a lot of time trying to think, okay, well, we've got to do some things to help to assist Māori progress, for want of a better term. But we also have to carry the public with us. And, people like Chris Finlayson spent a huge amount of time thinking about that.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think, and partly it's caused by the large Māori caucus in Labour who get impatient. And then in 05 we had Tariana and Pita moving away. And this time around it's a variation of the theme. And unfortunately, I think, the national-led government, if one happens after this election, will have to do this sort of patch things back together again that we really had to do in 08.
But one of the things, surely, that Chris Finlayson and Bill English and John Key to some degree did in terms of kind of moving things forward, as you say, Chris Finlayson has done a lot to forward the co-governance approach. whether or not whatever
In
we
particular
call
areas,
it, whatever we call
Yeah.
it. But part of that success was resisting any temptation to use rhetoric like Kiwi iwi, wasn't it?
Oh, it was that was of its time, the 0405 thing. And what you're hearing now is of its time. But politicians ultimately just reflect the public in a way. Not all the public, but their job is to reflect the concerns of the public. And there is wide concern at the state of race relations in this country at the moment, whether you agree with it or not. It's there. It's unlikely that politicians would ignore it.
Yeah.
It's their job to actually go out and find out what concerns people and to have solutions.
But at the same time, I mean,
yes, you can go about it in different ways.
John Key, who you work with so closely
yeah.
on those campaigns, seemed to be very cognizant all the time of not. I mean, he, at the time, I remember interviewing him at the Herald at one point. And there was he was challenged by Audrey Young about how the National Party policy at that time was still to remove Māori seats, but he was. Very openly pragmatic about it. I think he used the word hikoi from hell, which was, is kind of...
He's an openly pragmatic person.
Exactly. Yeah. And he didn't want to
Don Brash is different.
Yeah.
I think, if you look at the wider sweep of history, the 05 election allowed for a more, meant that somebody like John could come in afterwards and... I don't think you could see it in the prism of race relations because you could see it in the prism of aspiration. His thing was to be a much more positive direction.
There was an optimistic, and it was there,
and it was right. I think.
It was there in the slogans, wasn't it? I mean, choose a brighter future, and then you had variations on brightness and future all the way through that you worked out. Yeah. I'm interested now if we cast forward to now.
Yeah.
Again, times are different. But what do you make of Get New Zealand Back on Track? That doesn't quite have that same rising dawn feeling about it.
But it's never going to be, though, is it? Because every election is different and every situation is different. And I'm assuming that they've worked out that a lot of people think the country's gone off track and therefore there's a market for somebody to come along and say, we'll get it back on track.
Has some echoes of Wayne Brown in that regard, doesn't it?
Well, I think I think it has echoes of the time. I mean, I think there is a sense, without getting too much into the current politics, but there is a sense that the country has gone off track somehow in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's shared by many people. And as you say, it was a successful sort of campaign, I suppose, for Wayne Brown. In his own way, it was a bit different to what the National Party's doing. But nevertheless, I think, politicians respond to public concern as a general rule. That's what they do.
Talofa Lover. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
I'm interested in your reflections on campaigns as someone who's been through many of them about what moves the dial and what doesn't. Maybe starting on debates, and you've got some interesting anecdotes about the debates through the book. There was and 2008 was an important one for John Key in kind of proving himself. And I love the idea of Nicola Willis playing Helen Clark at length. And then, of course, 2011, the Show Me the Money, all those sorts of things. How important are debates, and do you think they're going to be important this time around?
Well, they're sort of important, but their importance often is because they provide catalytic points where things that have been brewing for a while, people can go, that. And that was the Show Me the Money thing in 11, as we'd been banging away for some time about our concerns about what Phil Goff was promising, and feeling that it was very detached actually from the reality of where the country was with the earthquakes and GFC and so on. And on the surface, we weren't getting a massive amount of traction with that, but it was building. And then John made that line in the Christchurch Press debate of all debates.
Yeah, the first time that had been held.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
and the first time it was purely online. And first time a debate that was purely online actually had an impact, really, at a national level.
And that sort of town hall style as well, right? Yeah.
And job done. I mean, and John didn't know that was going to have the impact it did, I don't think, ahead of time. But it worked, and he had the smarts to stop there. Right, it's done. And so I think that debates allow for those moments. And if you look at 2008, really what was going on there was that, as I said in the book, that Labor really believed that Helen Clark was the ace, and she was so far ahead of John Key in terms that she would just sort of wipe the floor with him. And that didn't happen. And so I think that was a different test, and a different test that he passed.
And maybe one that has more similarities to this time around, because obviously Chris Hipkins hasn't been the Prime Minister for anywhere near the length of time that Helen Clark had, but he's been around.
Yes.
He's been around back, in your time there. He knows how to do debating in the House. He thrives on that. Chris Luxon is more untested. So going into that square up, what would your advice be to Christopher Luxon?
They're getting dangerously close to me commentating on the current campaign. There'd be a range of advice, but I think for all of them, the key thing is to, and this may sound a bit sort of hackneyed, but just sort of learn your stuff and then relax and be yourself, and don't get too freaked if you make a mistake, because actually it's not about that. It's getting, sometimes commentators get very excited if there's a slip up, but the public is sort of, if it's a slip up that catalyses something they believe, then that's a big deal. But most of the time, they know that politicians are human, and they give them quite a lot of latitude of stuff that doesn't concern them.
It is that headlights thing sometimes that can be the risk, right? And you talk about it in the book, I think, a bit in terms of the 2017 campaign when everything moved suddenly. And there are a few of those that you were involved with. The other one that, I remember being constantly eventful and unpredictable was 2014, which you talk about.
Quite weird.
Complete roller coaster, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that was
But it was also weird because prior to that election campaign period, the country had sort of been sailing along. There hadn't been that sort of build of concern.
Yeah.
And then all these wacky characters came out of the woodwork.
Yeah. It was as if Stephen Levine had ordered them up to make this book and conference more interesting.
A bit more interesting, because it wasn't looking that way.
And we had, for those whose memories don't stretch that far back or have deleted it from their memories, we had the Nicky Hager book, Dirty Politics.
Yes.
And we had Kim.com's political vehicle, which reached its denouement in that incredible, strange town hall moment of truth event. Running a campaign when that sort of stuff is happening, A, how do you deal with it and keep people kind of on message and keep people sort of from reeling? And I guess B, does it move the dial?
Well, the moment of truth moved the dial in our favour.
In your favour?
Yep, absolutely. But your wider question is I think you've got to have a really good campaign system, because there's huge potential for the wheels to fall off in an election campaign. And one thing I learned from the Liberals when I went over, before I even did the first one, was they have a machine. Everybody knows their role.
Right.
There's a rhythm to the day, and they rely on that rhythm. And probably the Labor Party in Australia does that as well, for all I know. But they do that, and that provides you with a scaffold, right, where things can go wrong, and they always go wrong. In that very first campaign, the Brethren and all that stuff, Bob Clarkson and his testicles, those things, there's just no way that you know what's going to happen. You just have to go, right, okay, here's where we are. Where do we go from here? And you need to be able to reassure your team, I think, that this isn't the end, that there'll be another thing along tomorrow. As politics, as my friend Wayne Eagleson says, is not a game of perfect.
You're going to have to remind people about Bob Clarkson and his testicles, for those who don't.
Well, Bob, he'd come into politics and for the 05 campaign to do one thing. He wanted to tip Winston Peters out of Tauranga. and he's a developer in Tauranga, and Bob's a rough diamond and talks like a guy on a building site of that era, and he just made no apologies and no attempt to sort of filter his language or anything through the whole campaign. It became a bit of a problem for us. So yes, he was beating Winston. Yes, he was going to win the seat of Tauranga, but he was very quotable. And I think it was Rebecca Wright who was dispatched to Tauranga to get, to see what she could find for the news. Not a difficult assignment. And we'd basically decided that we had to get somebody else to work with Bob, and Tony Ryle, his neighbouring MP, senior MP, was asked to work with, and they did this interview. And it all went pretty well, really, and literally you could just about see in the clip afterwards Tony sort of starting to relax. And then at the very end of it, Bob stood up and sort of rearranged his trousers and said, "Oh, look, I just got to go out and drain the spuds." And and of course that led the news. But the worst part about that was Don's reaction. Not that, I feel sorry for Don because he got stuck with it. The next thing, the TV crew that are with him in Hawke's Bay. But Don sort of uttered the immortal line, frankly, I don't want any of my candidates talking about their testicles. and of course that clip was gold. And that went to everybody because it was in a stand-up. So, so that was the day.
Straight, like the Don Brash thing is so interesting that he had so much of what he needed, but there was a bit missing, wasn't there? And there's another bit you relay when you had gone to work through his talking points with him. And correct me if I've got this wrong, but you explained them to him, he nodded and took it all on board and said, well, this is all very well and good, but of course I won't be able to use any of these unless they ask me.
That's right. And he just never got that, the requirement for a politician.
It's kind of endearing in a way.
Endearing. Endearing. Well, it is. It is. I mean, he would sit in front of you and answer your actual question. That's how BFM got him to talk about the Britain. They just asked him.
Yeah.
He goes, oh, well, actually, da-da-da-da-da. And everybody else, including me, and what?
Yeah.
Where did that come from? But yeah, it was sort of endearing, but actually, part of the job is being able to both answer the questions and say what you want to say. And that's the gig.
In all of those campaigns, John Key, at a certain point, I think normally quite early in election year, and he started the tradition, the welcome tradition of announcing election days, which you resisted, I think you say in the book.
Initially.
But it's quite a nice tradition. But he would also lay out clearly, from position of strength, what the relationship would be with potential coalition partners.
Well, he only did that in 14, actually, because in 11, we didn't lay it out until the fateful week of the teapot tape.
That was when it was made, but it was still made clear, right?
Well, yes, but I have to go back and check. The 2014 was definitely when he decided, having had the experience of 2011, he didn't want to have anything like that ever again. He wanted to get it out on the table.
Ambiguity.
Yeah, he wanted to get it out on the table, be clear. And look, to your point, he had the advantage of incumbency. He had the advantage of knowing who it was he could work with, and so plenty of reasons that he could do that.
But in 2008, 2011, correct me if I'm wrong, he ruled out working with New Zealand First.
Yes,
and then he said, I think in 2014, and then Bill English subsequently in 2017, not our preference was the statement, but we will deal. The cards we're dealt, or cliche of your choice. Why isn't Christopher Luxon doing that? It seems it's puzzling to me.
Well, I think it's. Well, again, I'm not there, but I would just counsel. There are some things you can draw from election to election, and there are other things you can't. And one of the things you can't is, the calculus of who you might work with. That very much depends on election by election and who's in the frame, and because you can both encourage and discourage. I mean, in 2002, Helen Clark, by taking the approach she did, ultimately, by mistake, I think, encouraged the public to start looking for coalition partners for her. And they started scattering votes away from Labour into the United Future or New Zealand First. And that was just a moment of time. So my point is, it's not an exact science, and you can't just sort of cookie cutter and go, right, this is what we should do every election. I think the date thing is good. I think the incumbent should name the date and long may it continue, because it actually does give the country a chance to, because we have quite a short election cycle, it gives the country to spend 2.5 years between elections instead of just 2, more than anything else.
Let's do the fiscal hole.
Sure.
The can't be avoided. I don't want to relitigate all of that.
No. Feel free.
I'm sure you would happily do it. You do, though, talk about how you knew at the time that it could, these are your words, explode in our faces.
Yeah.
You knew that it was a high risk.
Yeah.
You were in a position where you needed to make something happen.
Yes. And in specifics, we knew there were problems with their numbers, but we just couldn't get anybody in the gallery to take any interest. Because it was, the gallery's sort of story was Jacinda mania, and sometimes there's some great people in the gallery, but sometimes the gallery can end up with a bit of a narrative of their own and what they think will happen, and then it gets quite hard to move that. And they weren't really, and there's a range of practical reasons which I list in the book as well, that they weren't really that excited about just comparing numbers and looking at these sorts of questions. So we had to do it differently, and we did. And I knew that it was going out and having a press conference and listing out all the numbers and releasing tables and things. Yeah, that's reasonably high risk, but I stand by it, and it was I think it was the right thing to do, and we're not going to litigate it. But I will say that subsequent events, I think, proved it correct.
Was it vindicated as a tactic? Do you think?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think because it did get the campaign back onto the stuff that was important, which was not just who you are, but what you're going to do, and particularly economically, which we felt was being brushed under the carpet. And so that's what happened. And actually we spent the remaining couple of weeks of the campaign focused on economic issues, and combination of that plus I think Bill just got stronger and stronger as the campaign went on. And possibly to some degree it was going to happen anyway, that you have Jacinda's star was sort of bright early on, but was it possible to sustain it all the way to the election? But we ended up 44-37, I think, in favour, and so I think it was a good campaign. I thought it was the best campaign in a campaign sense, because it was a time when actually we got to change, where the campaign as a whole effectively sort of was able to change the outcome that was apparent with about a month to go.
You had to pivot.
We had to pivot a number of ways. Yeah.
It's an interesting point that you make in passing in the book, in which I think you say that campaigns are often an exercise in contrasts.
Yes.
And that there it was laid bare, right? The campaign you thought you were running.
It wasn't it anymore.
One.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we were there, competent, sensible, and Labor had struggled with the various leaders, and Andrew Little wasn't cutting through, and so on, and he was a bit angry, and it was all fine. And suddenly Jacinda became the leader, and we'd previously looked competent. We started to look out of date because she was new and shiny and all those things, and we were no longer. So you think, okay, well, how do you respond to that?
I mentioned at the top the fiscal holes are very much around us at the moment. The backing and forthing of them. Would you accept now? I can't recall what your position was then, that an independent costings unit might take some of this. I mean, even before the pre-election fiscal update, just somebody to say, it's not to be definitive, just to say, yeah.
Well, I think the risk is that it just adds another player. And I would go and look at countries which have those things and ask, does that remove those debates? In the UK and in the US, I think both have them. Look, and I'm not saying we won't end up with one, but I just think people are probably a bit naive if they think that that's going to solve the argument.
But it might have, wouldn't it?
Because in the US, they end up beating up on the Congressional Budget Office, and it's just like one more pinata to have a go at.
Sure. I guess it's sort of someone, even it's just kind of, you talk about all these competing narratives, someone to just sort of lay out, these are the...
I'd just love it if they had some financial journalists that actually would take this.
The media's to blame. The media's to blame.
No, they're not to blame. I just think, the media struggles actually because of the resourcing issues and all those things. But I think some more analysis of what actually is happening, more sort of picking up the calculator, would I think be good for the country.
So that election, your lot won more seats,
yes,
comfortably,
but didn't get to be the government. That's correct.
That chap Winston Peters again was involved. You were in the room for those. There's some interesting kind of detail about the nature of those negotiations.
Yeah,
let's not traverse all of that. But do you think that you were sold a pup? Do you think that you were really just leverage and that he was always going Labour's way?
I don't know. I've reported in the book that Jerry decided quite early on that was what was happening.
Jerry Brownlee thought they were being led on.
Yeah, after a couple of days, he said, "Oh no, they're not coming with us."
Yeah,
and he's quite a good judge of what's happening. Actually, I tend to find it a bit self-defeating to sort of try and aspire motives to what people are up to. I sort of tend to sort of focus a bit more on what they were doing. And anyway, what was our alternative? Was just to sort of throw a fit and leave. It may not have been he may not have been serious. He may just have been using us as leverage. I mean, who knows? He got a lot out of them, partly as a result of that. So maybe he was. I know there were people in New Zealand First who really wanted to come with us, and then there were people, including Winston, who wanted to go with them, and that's what happened.
And he sort of seemed to have basically just a checklist.
Yeah.
That will you give us that, rather than any kind of grand conversation about.
Oh, I'm sure there were grand conversations with the leaders.
Okay.
But quite late in the piece.
Right.
But he just seemed to want to get what he wanted. I don't have a better answer for this sort of Dutch auction that occurs, but it does seem to be. And I'm not against MMP, but it does mean that a lot of what people say before an election, it's convenient to sort of slide out from a lot of that afterwards. And I do think you wouldn't want to have too often the largest party being kicked over. I mean, you have to have the capacity for that. But I think if you had that happening too often, then you'd end up with people questioning the electoral system again. We don't really want to go through yet another change.
You were branded the Mr. Fix-It, the Minister of Everything, all quite nice things. I called you the Cabinet Slipcordon at one point, which was meant as a compliment.
Oh, okay.
But you can sort of walk away feeling as though you have a pretty good record on delivery. You're proud of your ultra-fast broadband, all those sorts of things.
Yeah,
What's your TED Talk? What's your shorter TED Talk for politicians of any stripe who are going into that weird machine, right? That weird machine.
It is a weird machine.
I mean, you note at one point you talk about yes minister and yes prime minister, and I sort of think you can tell a bit the nature of a politician by their choice of political TV show,
right.
Or political. Jamie Lee Ross, of course, the American version of House of Cards. Some are West Wing, some are think of it, whatever. You're a yes minister. Chris Finlayson is a yes minister. He named his book after it, didn't he?
Yes.
Tell us a bit about how you go about getting stuff done.
Well, I start from the position genuinely that most people go to work each day to do a good job. And so it was the same in radio as in politics. You say, okay, well, then it's being clear what success looks like, and then testing what they're doing to sort of check that they're, heading on the path, and being clear yourself, to acknowledge that you can make plenty of mistakes in the way you communicate things. And so that's sort of the approach I took with it. And when I went into politics, I thought, geez, this is really different to commercial world, and it is. But there are levers, and it's about working out where the levers are and the levers that will have an impact, and not getting diverted into scraps about stuff that have no consequence. And so I would try and think, okay, well, keep in mind always, what are we trying to achieve here? And the other thing I said in the book at one point, which I do genuinely believe, is when you're in a bit of a bind and you're in a conversation and you're sort of cross-examining the officials, keep in mind for yourself, what does the public actually expect of you at this point? You are the public's representative. If they were sitting here, if somebody from Taranaki or Hawke's Bay was sitting here, what would be their question, and what would be the answer they'd accept, and what would be the one they wouldn't accept, and ask those questions and get those answers. And you can't go too far wrong.
Moving to something that's slightly more celebrity focused, you've now carved your name into the meme annals of New Zealand politics, or at least twice actually. There's the Eminem pretty legal thing.
Yeah.
Which I noticed you forgot to mention in your book that you had to pay $600,000 for that, didn't you?
It's a bit more nuanced than that,
and
I decided, and there is some legal requirements around who can say what about whom. So I decided not to.
I just thought you'd
go about that. I did think I'd point out it. Well, actually, it didn't land the way it looked to land.
Oh,
yeah, because there were other parties that also had culpability and things. But let's not.
Okay.
For all sorts of reasons, let's not get into that. So it wasn't an attempt to hide it.
That sounds pretty accurate. Yeah. The other one was the squeaky pecker, to give it its correct name.
Oh, well, yeah, okay.
The Waitangi incident.
Yes.
When you were hit on the bonce with that phallic object.
Yes.
And it
was meant for John, by the way. I don't think I've heard it. She took it to Waitangi for John.
So you were the bouncer.
I was the substitute.
You were DPS
him,
for
I
the
took
day.
that for you.
I took the no. I don't. No, I'm going to end that sentence. That doesn't go well. But you decide? I mean, you talk about you decide you've got to take that in good humour.
Yeah.
And
what's the alternative?
John Oliver. Well, I don't know. I mean, because. Or to put it another way, if that happened today, I mean, it is quite funny, in one sense, but if it happened today, it might land, not literally, but it might land differently, given the climate is different about threats made to politicians after the occupation and various things like that.
Possibly. Possibly, but it could have, I suppose, sort of contradicting my previous answer, I suppose it could have been the same then. I mean, I could have just said, right, well, that's not good enough, and when the police came and asked me about pressing charges, even though it's their decision, I think they like to get a read from the person who was the subject to what do you think, and I just thought that it was best just laughed off because it was sort of funny. And there's a part of me that's sort of anarchic radio from way back. So, there is sort of funny stuff.
Did 1,000 dildos fly?
We used to in student radio, we used to go around gifting cabbages to the general manager of 2XS and stuff. So, that stuff is there's a certain anarchic part of it. But I think it was also not to take it too seriously, because the world doesn't need more of that sort of offence to be taken, and nobody got hurt, and dusted ourselves off and went on our way, and it was strange. I mean, It's constantly used on social media as a form of insult to me, which I find amusing because I don't think it was something I caused. But there you go.
You mean now or back in the day?
Still, yeah.
Still?
If somebody wants to have a go at me on social media, they generally pick up a meme of that and throw it at me.
Well, when you do one of your nice tweets about your cabbage patch.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I ignore all that now, so that's all good.
There's another strong line in your book when you talk about John Key's decision to resign. When he calls you up and you said that you could tell immediately by the tone that by the end of the conversation, one of you wasn't going to be in their job anymore.
Yeah, it's just a matter of working out which one. That's right.
And that moment, which is an important one in the history of the National Party, isn't it? Was it inevitable from that point that things would fall apart?
No, and I don't think they did.
Well, they did.
Not until
after a period of time.
Yeah.
I guess
I don't think it was inevitable at all.
Yeah.
But as you say, it did happen. It was about 2020, so it was about 4 years later from after he left. So no, I don't think.
I asked because Andrew Vance's book Blue Blood sort of has that as the kind of the.
That's her theory.
That's the moment
on
it starts.
Yeah, but I just don't think that's right. I think it really started when Bill retired.
Started with the investigation of the 2002 campaign that failed to identify. No, I'm kidding, carry on.
No, it was when Bill retired after 17.
Yeah.
That's when it really started. And I think at that point I think actually John could walk away and say, well, actually the transition that he engineered to Bill worked really well, I think. And the evidence is there. I mean, the election outcome, notwithstanding Winston, was about as good as you could get. The real challenge for us in 2017 was that we lost the Māori Party out of the Parliament, and as a result, the calculus just wasn't there for us.
And you, by your own account, had some ambivalence about the leadership when it became vacant, when Bill English decided to leave. Do you think?
Well, I was keen on it at one level, but my theory on this, and I didn't say it in the book, is that the thing about politics is particularly if you've got family, the bar gets higher the longer you stay, and the bar, I think, I probably didn't know it at that point, but the bar was getting pretty high. You know, Tommy's struggles and
it's your son who was diagnosed with autism.
Yeah, and Amelia was struggling without a dad there, and there's a point coming. There was always a point coming when it was time to go, and so in a way, not getting the leadership sort of was helpful in that respect.
Do you think you might have had a better shot at the leadership, or been a different sort of politician in terms of the lead up to that, had you been an electorate MP? There were a few opportunities along the way for you to go that way.
It might have been, but I think probably the biggest difference would have been I'd had to decide that was what I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I'd planned for it and talk to colleagues and get to know them extra well and do what the things that prospective leaders do, learning how to count colleagues and things. And I was always really busy on the main gig and really didn't have any spare capacity anyway. And I hadn't really thought through that was my thing. And so, that was probably the main reason.
Just on that National Party episode, which you can talk about now, it seems to be over. It happened after you left.
Yeah.
Sort of ritual self-immolation. You guys had all seen what happened in the Labour Party. Most of the people there had watched. How did it?
I don't know.
How does it happen?
As you
How
say,
do you repeat exactly the?
I wasn't there. I think the trouble is that sometimes in organisations, people think that anybody can be the leader, and actually they're not as probably as unique as you think at the other extreme, but they're also not as common as some people think. And it's actually a really tough job, and it's a very tough job in opposition. And obviously too many people thought that they could do it. And do
you think because John Key sort of made it look easy from the outside in a way, or if you weren't in that kitchen cabinet, is that what you mean?
I that's part of it, yeah. And it's not easy. None of it's easy. I mean, and the funny thing is too, is when things look easy, people just forget them anyway. I talk in the book about that period in 08 to 11 where we reportedly didn't do much, and the narrative around 2011 was they're not really doing that much, and then you look back and think, well, there was the tax switch, there was this, there was that, there was the broadband, and there was the roading, and and there was stuff in health and so on. It's actually quite a bit, but because it went quite smoothly, everybody goes, oh, that was pretty easy. Why didn't they do some real stuff? And I think that's the same with political leadership, is that when it looks easy, suddenly everybody thinks they can do it.
Tell us a bit about life after politics. Tell us about your son Tommy and the work you've done around autism.
Well, my work around autism has ended up being much more about Tommy than about people generally, and that's because he's needed it. Unfortunately, he, as is quite common with people with autism, he developed epilepsy as well. About 1 in 3 kids with autism also get epilepsy, which seems, cosmically unfair to those kids. And so he developed that in 19, I think it was. And unfortunately, we had a period initially where we found a set of drugs that stopped it. But unfortunately, we haven't subsequently. So he has to deal with that as well as everything else. And I think for all families that are in that situation, you have to sort of circle the wagons a little bit and spend a bit more time on that. He's a lovely kid, and it's great to spend more time around him. And his sister Amelia, who has developed the running bug, and is a great little runner. And it's just great to go to all her events.
She's got you out there.
Oh, she's got me running too,
shorts.
which is outrageous.
Yeah.
I've ended up running, cross-country events with harriers around Auckland, which is just unheard of. But that mainly because Amelia dared me to.
Yeah.
So that's sort of fun.
And
I've probably developed work-life balance.
And doing sort of contract work,
Yeah.
really, sort of charging outrageous amounts of money to
Apparently.
Waikato University. And
Apparently.
stuff like that. Yeah. And are you going to be the Brian Roche of the new national government? Will you be the
I have
will
no
you be
idea. I'm
brought
actually
into-
quite busy with a list of clients that I really enjoy working
All
with.
right, okay. There's the last line, and the last paragraph in the book almost reads like you're writing it down so you can't go back on it, that you're definitely done with politics.
Oh,
You're
right.
definitely
Does it read that
done
way?
with politics. Oh, something like that. It is time for more balance, but I'm beyond it. I won't do it again.
Oh, okay. Maybe I overdid that. But no, it is genuinely it. People ask me, and I'm sure lots of ex-politicians get asked, but I do get asked quite a bit. And I've noticed that my answer has shifted. Whereas previously I'd say something like, "Oh, look, thanks very much. Job's done," all that sort of thing. And now I just sort of turn to people and sort of grin and say, "Really?" I'm just not going back there again.
Yeah.
And I think that's the passage of time. It's unwinding and learning the value of everything else in your life.
The last thing I'm going to ask you is you note in your acknowledgements that Chris Finlayson put you onto Miff Hurley at Allen and Unwin
Yes.
to do the book. So in keeping a tradition going, who are you going to now nominate as the next politician that will write a memoir for?
Don't know the answer to that
Unwin?
question.
It doesn't have to be from your own party. You can
No.
you can nominate anybody you like.
Yes.
Who might have an interesting story that isn't obviously interesting?
Yeah. That's intriguing, and I don't have an answer for you there, I'm afraid.
Morris
Toby.
Williamson comes up a bit earlier in your book.
Yes,
Maybe-
Morris
maybe
does.
he
Well,
should
he
write
would have well, he's busy in politics, of course.
Todd Barclay.
Todd
What happened
Barclay.
to him?
Well, yes. Well, there's a few names, isn't there?
Jamie Lee Ross.
I won't be suggesting it, but it would be an interesting book.
Well, come back to us with an answer when you've got one.
Sure.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming us.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.